Hi, my name is Wilhelmina Duncan, and I'm starting us off with a little information about our main learning tool for this course. We primarily use LinkedIn Learning courses such as Blender Essential Training 2.79 by George Maestri. Since we're using an older version of Blender, the course is archived, but the link on screen can still take you there. Newer versions on LinkedIn Learning are also available. The Blender interface. The default interface for Blender 2.79 looks like this. The layout saves with the file, so if you change it or adjust it, it will save. If you open an existing file, it will load that layout and not the default. Blender comes with its own preset layouts. You can also customize one and save it as its own to use again later. Here are some commonly used layouts. The animation layout is used for making animations. The compositing layout is used for editing materials and textures with nodes. UV editor layout is for mapping objects, so image textures look accurate. The custom layout is whatever you want it to be. Most of the time it's used to duplicate windows to see different angles of your model. Editors. The outliner is where you can find your objects in the scene. You can rename them here to help keep track of multiple objects and select specific ones. The Properties panel includes several different editors that can change based on the selected object. In the Object Properties panel, the most commonly used editors are Render, World, Object, Modifiers, Material, and Texture. It is highly recommended to use a keyboard with a number pad and a mouse with a scroll wheel to navigate the 3D space of Blender. Without these tools, it is much more difficult to do so.
I'm going to be explaining chapter 2. Right here we have transforming the objects from one position to another by using these arrows here. I have it on local, so that is heading straight towards the cube. That's going to be heading straight towards the sphere. Now we have it on global, which is on default. It will be going alongside the grid as a universal axis. And then we have the object transformation, where we can go to the transform and change the origin. So if I were to change the origin to the 3D cursor, it'll be all the way over here, moving around. The pivot point is going to be on that specific spot of the square or the cube. And if I were to spin it around, it would spin around in this certain way. Now we have scales. We can make them grow on the axes provided. And then last but not least, we have the pivot point to the 3D cursor, which if I were to put the pivot point here, I can move it to the pivot point to the 3D cursor and grow it from there. And last but not least, we have the snap. So if I were to snap here, this cube will automatically snap alongside the grid. That is all. Thank you.
And now we will be doing Blender Essentials Training Chapter 3. So Chapter 3 goes over modeling. And in this, it goes over a number of different techniques for modeling simple and complex shapes in Blender. For example, proportional editing, it can be done through the mesh editor and enabling proportional editing or using the hotkey O. This allows the user to edit a number of vertices or edges all at once. Once you have selected those vertices or edges, you can use the G key to grab them and move them. Then on the example below, I grabbed edges and vertices on both cheeks and then the forehead, and then put some in and drew some out to make it more of a unique character design. Next, extrusions. It's another interesting procedure to use. This is done by selecting the object and going into edit mode, face mode, and then selecting the faces and scrolling down to extrude faces. There are other options for extrusion as well, such as extrude individual, extrude long normals, and extrude to cursor. Now I have two examples below. The object on the left, I extruded each face individually. So I took the cursor and extruded each face with my own hand. And then the object on the right, I extruded each face all at once, so they're all the same length, same level, so it all looks the same and uniform, and it gives it a much more unique look. The next, subdivision meshes, is another form of modeling. It is done by selecting an object under the Add panel and then selecting Subdivide. This cuts the face or faces of the object into a certain number of sections specified by the user. The user can also select an option to randomize the number of vertices created for more distinctive shapes. So the object on the right, I subdivided the entire object, I want to say by about 100. And then the object on the left, I selected it and just put on random number of subdivide meshes, and it did that random look on the only the front because I put it to random.
Advanced modeling. Modifiers are used to modify your objects. Different effects can be achieved through a combination of modifiers, but be careful, the order matters. Each one has different options and functions. The most commonly used modifier is subdivision surface, or subsurf for short. Subdividing objects creates more polygons, but too many can slow down the render time. It's recommended to use less than 4 subdivisions. Also, make sure your view and render subdivisions are the same number. If you want your object to hold its edges, make sure to add edge loops before applying the modifier. The mirror modifier is a way to symmetrically build a character. The object must be cut in half before you can use it properly, otherwise you'll be getting a lot of unwanted overlapping. Make sure to hit apply once finished to complete the mesh of the character. The mesh of an object is what you see in edit mode. You can join objects together while in edit mode. The last object selected becomes the main object. If there are any modifiers still active, it will affect the new object. Stitching vertices is important when joining objects together. If there are open gaps between the object, that's a problem. The faces must first be deleted to stitch the vertices together, and there must be the same number of vertices on both sides. Modifiers can also be applied to text. Blender has its own fonts available. Text can also be rendered. Boolean modifier has 3 options: difference, union, intersect. Difference takes away from the object where the 2 objects overlap. Union adds the 2 objects together except for the overlap. And intersect is the area where the objects overlap and nothing else.
Okay, this is chapter 5. Right here on our upper right, we can see the menu for the items that we have in the scene. I can select them, and then we have hierarchies. And creating hierarchies, we can, for example, have a fruit bowl right here, and create this to be control P as a parent to an object like an orange. And wherever the bowl will move around, so will the orange. We can also use layers, which is right here on the bottom center. And we can see, we can click on these. We have the floor as one of the layers. We have just the furniture, and we have the fruit bowl. Now, if I were to press Shift, and click on all of these layers together, we can see all of them in view. And when we're working with scenes, we can either duplicate the scene up top right here by pressing this button by adding a new scene, or we can right click it and then copy the data path so we can create a copy of the scene. And while creating groups, we can click this couch with this table, this other table, this chair, and these chairs, and create a group, and we can name it however we want. So we just say furniture, and we can add that in there. And all these highlighted would be under that group of furniture.
And now I'll be doing Blender Essentials Training, Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is all about applying materials, and Blender allows the user to apply a number of different materials to their objects. For example, adding diffuse shaders allows the user to change the color of an object. There's also a specular shader, which will remove the highlight from the object, making it look a lot darker in the render. And in the image example below, I remove the specular shader from the object so that the image will look a lot darker once you render it out. There's still light on it coming from the lamp, but the highlight is gone. And next, creating reflections objects is done first by going into the materials panel and scrolling down to the mirror section. You usually want to adjust the reflectivity option, which will make the object reflect the scene or the other objects within the scene. And as you can see the image below, I did just this. And there's also an option for the user to more exactly reflect the scene or the objects within the specific scene in a much more an exact presence.
Adding textures. The texture of an object is its visual surface. An object can have multiple textures. Blender has some textures built in, otherwise you'll have to import them as an image. There's a lot you can do with textures, and it takes some practice to understand how they work. This can also be said for just about anything in Blender, so don't worry, there are many roads to reach the same conclusion. Using bitmaps or images in Blender has advantages. With images, you can create your own custom texture to get a specific effect. You can use images online or create your own. Word of advice: for bigger projects, keep all your textures in the same folder and specifically named. If the file is moved or deleted, the texture will break and you'll have to re-add them back in. Complicated objects need to be mapped in the UV editor. Seams need to be placed on the object in order to unwrap it and apply the image directly to the correct zones. These zones are called islands. More complex objects, like the chair on the right, need a little extra step. The extra step for this object was exporting the UV map and placing the texture over each island manually so that it flowed correctly. After that is done, the new image is added back as the texture. This process is a lot easier than it sounds. UV mapping something like a character is a little different from a piece of furniture. The best way to think of it is to imagine it's a stuffed animal when creating the seams. The type of geometry the object is important to know while mapping. The creature in these images consists of cubes and cylinders, so these parts need to be mapped differently. Displacement mapping is a different form of texturing an object. This process actually changes the object itself instead of just placing a mask over it. If the object does not have enough detail or faces on it, it will not be affected by the displacement. If you run into this issue, just apply subdivision surface. Images can also be used. The node editor is going to be your best friend while creating textures. The node editor allows you to mix and match different textures and materials to create a unique effect. Nodes are an important part of creating a complex and realistic object.
This is chapter 8. In chapter 8, we can see that this is ambient occlusion. I have it turned on, and if I were to change the factor, it will be more the shadows will be more noticeable and the light will be a little bit dimmer. Now I can change the color also, have a little bit brighter, and if I were to change the color, I can change it to green, and that's my ambient occlusion. I'll just change it back to dark and turn it off. And now we want to add a little bit of light into this world. So if I want to do that, I just go and add the object of the lamp and set it as a point. And if I were to put it a little bit closer to the cup, we can see that the light is only being seen on that specific point, just like this name pursues. Then we have the sun. So the sun, it doesn't matter where it is, but if we were to turn it, we can see that the direction of the sun's rays are apparent. And then we have spot, and it works just like a spotlight that we have in theaters and in shows. Then we have a Hemi-light. It doesn't matter where it is, but if I were to turn it, the same thing as the sun, except it's directional. It's a directional light. And I have area, where as the same as where the sun goes or the Hemi-light goes, except this is also positional. All right, and then last but not least, we have adding background light. we can set the horizon color to blue, and we can see that the background is blue. And if we go to texture, I can add a texture and add either clouds, or I can add a picture or a video in behind the scenes, and I can blend it.
And now we're on to Blender's Essential Training, Chapter 9. And this chapter was all about cameras and rendering. And a useful skill taught in this chapter was creating cameras with targets and constraints. With this, the user is able to set the camera to specific objects. For this to work, the user must add a camera into a scene, then globally or locally move the camera, then go to the object constraint and select Damp Track. This allows the user to then select the camera to only target the specified object and then setting the position of that object. And the image rendered below, I did just this and set the camera to only be targeted by the specific object, which is the male character's face. And that is the only thing the camera will be focused on. And next, another unique technique is motion blur. This is a good tool for adding realism to the rendered image and or animation. This can be done by going to the render properties and selecting the motion blur option. Then to check if it is applied, select the render image option, or you can use the hotkey F12.
Basic animation. The timeline is the core to the animation process. In the timeline, you will see your keyframes marked as yellow. You can also set how many frames the animation will be and on what frame the animation starts and ends. You can play your animation forwards, backwards, or just step through one frame at a time. Keyframes are extremely important. Think of them as moving between different points. The most important thing to remember when animating is always place your starting keyframe before you start animating. It's easy to forget this step, but it's very important. And for an animation to work, you need a minimum of 2 keyframes. You place the keyframes and the program does the rest of the work as evenly as possible. Keyframes show up as yellow bars in the timeline, but only for objects you have selected. You can add keyframes in manually or automatically by toggling the red button at the bottom of the timeline. What it does is it places keyframes based on whatever you change, but only on the frame that you have selected. Animating an object includes the changeable values of that object. Anything with a value can be animated, and if it's marked as a keyframe, it will highlight that value yellow. If you look at the value in between keyframes, it will be highlighted green instead. This just means it's moving, but it's not the keyframe. The position of the object, its rotation, and even its size can be animated. If your object has any shape groups, these can be animated as well, and all you have to do is just place the keyframes. As stated before, anything with a value can be animated. Different properties such as light and color can be animated. It's the exact same process as animating an object. The only difference is that these values will be found in a different panel. There are different ways to animate, but for time's sake, I will only cover path animation. Path animation is exactly as it sounds. You create a path for an object to follow and clamp the object to it, then set the keyframes to personalize the animation so it's more realistic looking than robotic even movements. For example, if an object is going straight down, it will move faster than if it were just rolling on the ground.
So this is chapter 11. We can see that the creature has an armature already built, and within this armature we have bones, and bones have to be implemented into the creature from the ground up, piece by piece, bone by bone, and the bones are on the bottom over here on the thigh part. These are connected to what is called inverse kinematics. And with inverse kinematics, there are basically empty objects that are connected to the character that allow for the bones or disallow the bones to go past the floor, and able to give a bend to the character's knees and the feet. And so it looks like that he is walking. And when I press play, this is to show that the animation is working. This is the test animation. You see how the bounce there is to the leg. That's how the inverse kinematics work. And we can also animate, or I mean edit towards his eyes and his mouth by using the shape keys. And these shape keys, we can press I, like I explained before, for inserting the keyframes for him to open and close his mouth and eyes. And then we have the little a circle, the circle, the Bezier circle that we had to implement here down here that allow him for movement around his pelvis, and it had to be connected to his pelvis as a parent. So whenever we move this part, it will move his waist as if it were a real waist. Now, last but not least, we have the pose animations, the pose mode that we can rotate and transform each of the bones and implement the I key to have it in that specific keyframe as we're animating the creature.